Okie dokie, we are going to get started today. Welcome back, everybody, for our second seminar of the semester. And I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Kara Brugman. She's a new assistant professor here at UNM with a joint appointment in the Earth and Planetary Sciences and our very own Institute of Meteoritics. She earned her PhD from Arizona State University and went on to be a postdoctoral fellow at Carnegie's Earth and Planets Lab, then moved back to Arizona State to be a research scientist in their new high-pressure lab, FORCE. Here at UNM, Dr. Brugman is the PI of the High Pressure Laboratory, a facility that simulates conditions equivalent to those in the Earth's crust and mantle. By creating molten rock, aka magma, in the lab under extreme temperatures and pressures, she studies the chemical composition of rocky planets and exoplanet magmas to better understand how rare Earth's habitable conditions may be. Alrighty, I will leave it to you, Dr. Brugman. Please take it away.
Thanks, Lydia, and thanks for Chip for inviting me to talk today. First, I'm going to show you if this catches up.
Yeah, there's like a little bit of a delay.
There we go. Okay, well, I'm going to close this thing. Okay, so this is unfortunately not animated right now, but this is an overview of all the Kepler observed planets as of 2023. And hopefully this gives you an idea of the diversity of planetary systems that we've observed in our galaxy. You see our solar system is here in the lower left corner. You see how very different the other solar systems we've observed so far look. And part of this has to do with our observation bias, of course, but you can see probably the most obvious thing is the huge close-in planets we have in some parts of our galaxy. So the exoplanets that we have in our solar system or in our galaxy are classified roughly into 4 categories. So we have the hot Jupiters, which are these, do I have pointer control this? No, okay. The hot Jupiters, which is the big yellow one, these are those giant close-in orbiting planets. Then we have mid-sized planets, which are the super Earths and the sub-Neptunes. And then the little guy, that's something that we call super Venus, which is a small but rocky planet that probably has a high greenhouse atmosphere. Now, the sub-Neptunes are smaller than the Neptune we have in our solar system, but it has a really thick atmosphere. So it's still more of a hydrogen-dominated planet. The planets that I'm focusing on today are super Earths, which are Earth-like in size, maybe slightly larger, but are likely to be rocky with a thinner atmosphere like we're more familiar with. So the big picture question that we've had probably since the beginning of time for humans is there life on other planets and are we alone? But I would be remiss if I didn't point out that despite what popular media keeps trying to tell the public, the habitable zone does not mean that there is life there. This just gives us a region of space where liquid water could occur. Inside that orbit, we have water vapor only, and outside of that orbit, we have water ice only. So it's only that there's liquid water here under the right conditions. And this is not really enough to evaluate a planet's habitability. There are a lot of other aspects that go into making a planet habitable. So today, in the era of JWST, a more pointed question is probably, can we detect evidence of life in our observations of exoplanet atmospheres? And for these observations to work, first we have to have the right amount of water, it turns out, to ensure organisms have access to the bioessential elements that are necessary for life. And we have the right amount of water to be able to trust or even detect these biosignatures. So for example, phosphorus is kind of a rate limiting bioessential element for life as we know it. It makes up the backbone of our DNA and the energy our cells use. But the way we get on Earth is it's weathered out of minerals subaerially from rocks, and it's washed into streams where that phosphate can be used by our happy little organism here. Unfortunately, if we increase the amount of water in a rocky planet to about 0.2 weight% bulk water in the planet, then we probably don't have any exposed land masses for an Earth-sized planet. This means that phosphorus cycle is going to be cut off or greatly slowed down. That's limited bioavailability of these crucial elements to life. And the news kind of gets worse. If we have this much bulk water in the planet, it turns out at this point, atmospheric oxygen, molecular oxygen detections are indistinguishable from geologically produced oxygen sources. So we're not able to use oxygen as a reliable biosignature if there's that much water in the planet. And you might say, great, let's just observe phosphorus instead. That seems like a pretty good target. But unfortunately, only about 1% of exoplanet host star observations include phosphorus. And we're also also not entirely sure how phosphorus would play out in the atmosphere of these other planets. So the amount of water a planet has is crucial not just for whether life can persist, but also for whether we have a hope of detecting this life. There's also other issues with exoplanet atmosphere observations, and this is the problem of degenerate atmospheric retrievals. So an atmospheric retrieval is done, you get an observed spectra of a planet's atmosphere, and then you basically run a bunch of models using a bunch of different atmospheric species and different abundances and try to match the spectral wiggles to each other. The best fit, you say that that's what the atmosphere is probably made of. So last April, we had this paper come out from the group in England saying that they had a high abundance and high significance observation of these two biogenic molecules in the atmosphere of this planet. And then almost immediately you have a flurry of papers saying, no, actually that's not true. In fact, you can see this Nature Astronomy paper, it was submitted just 10 days after that paper was published. And a lot of the issues have to do with not only do we really know enough about DMS and DMDS to actually say whether detection is a definitive detection of life, but there's also some issues about, well, how are you actually doing your modeling? How are you actually doing the comparison? And are the checks that you're doing actually real? Because it turns out if you just compare this atmosphere spectra to a flat line, it gives no better fit than the fit that they presented in this paper. So the fact is that without some expectation of the surface conditions of the planet and some knowledge of the geological processes that are happening there, and specifically the rates of those geological processes, the atmospheric retrievals are basically unconstrained. So as a geologist, I think we need to actually back up from these questions and ask the more fundamental question, which is, can a given star host a planet that is habitable to life as we know it over a long period of time? And it would obviously be great to have some kind of information about this question before we finalize our observation targets and start spending a lot of time just staring at one system, hoping to find, oxygen or something like that. So my research group and my grant group think this is possible. And we think that what we actually need to think about is whether a planet is geochemically habitable. So does it have the right baseline geological foundations for life as we know it? Does it have the right amount of water, which now we know that has to do with the bioavailability of elements, and also whether we're actually able to detect biosignatures and rely on them? Do we have a life-friendly atmosphere? Is it not too thick, not too thin, not too toxic, not too high pressure? And do we have a solid surface? And are we able to get elements that are buried beneath the surface during rock forming processes back to the surface where our organisms can use them? So to understand all of this, we need some geochemical information about planets outside of our solar system. And as geologists, we're really great at modeling Earth's geochemistry, but we do need the right kind of training data to extend our models beyond our solar system for the compositions of other types of rocky planets. And we're going to get that data from experiments where we melt a planet's mantle. So why is mantle melting important? So this is a picture of some melted mantle and crust material on Earth. And volcanoes and their lava, this is how a planet makes new crust where life as we know it can live. In this photo, you can also see these big gas plumes. The amount of gas released into the atmosphere is related to the composition of the melted rock. And so in this way, the composition of the planet's interior has a direct influence on the parts of the exoplanet that we have the potential to measure, the surface and the atmosphere. I just talked about some of the issues with atmospheric retrievals, and we really need to know more about the planet's geochemical composition to be able to rule out geological abiotic sources for these species. And measuring an exoplanet surface composition that's going to give us any real meaningful geologic information other than like, oh, it's a basalt. That's probably decades or maybe several decades away. So we really need a geochemical context in order to interpret our atmospheric observations from our telescopes. We think that mantle and crust melting is a pretty ubiquitous phenomenon. It certainly is in our solar system. Here I'm showing a plot of all the rocky bodies in our solar system, plus the moon. And the pink bars are showing times of known volcanism, of intermittent volcanism, and the gray bars are showing times of inferred volcanism. So you can see that there's been some kind of planetary melting happening on these bodies for almost their entire history. And it's reasonable to think that this kind of melting is common on exoplanets too. And not in the oceans where most or maybe all of the mantle is molten. is probably a common phenomenon too, especially for young planets or planets that are much more massive than the Earth. So even if there's not a volcano per se, we can have melting from like accretionary processes, collisions between planetesimals and asteroids, that kind of thing. So we're going to use the same kind of laboratory experiments that have been conducted on all of these solar system bodies, including asteroids and meteorites, and use them on exoplanets. So the type of experiment itself is not new, but just the application of it is new. I'm an experimental petrologist, which means that I use lab experiments to learn about the geochemistry of melted planet mass and tests. I use an apparatus called a piston cylinder, which allows us to simulate the temperature and pressures in a planet's crust and upper mantle. You can see on the right, this is what our experimental assembly looks like. The tiny gray thing in the middle, that's our capsule. All of that goes into our pressure vessel, which is the S and sample on the far left. That goes into our stack, and then we pressurize using 2 hydraulic rams. So I'm going to talk to you today about 2 different types of mantle melting experiments, partial mantle melting experiments, and then whole mantle melting experiments to simulate a mag motion. So first, let's talk about the surface composition of rocky exoplanets. Can rocky exoplanets that do not have the same composition as Earth have a surface chemistry that is conducive to life as we know it? And the first question is probably, how do we get these compositions for our experiments? I just told you that a surface spectra is decades away, and we're not getting any samples anytime soon. But what we do have are the compositions of host stars. So here I have a ternary molar abundances showing the compositions of nearby FGK stars in black. These are the stars that are most similar to our sun. And we have our sun in the gold star. And I'm showing this plot in terms of the 3 elements that are most important to the composition of silicate melt on Earth. The gray lines here are showing areas of equal cation ratio. So for example, the line that goes kind of through our sun has a Mg to Si ratio of about 1.0. So what we're interested in is constraining the possible range of exoplanet compositions, rocky exoplanet compositions. So to do that, we're going to convert these star compositions to a bulk exoplanet composition. And we're doing this by removing a portion of iron to simulate core differentiation. So the tire point cloud is moving away from the iron apex, and this translates to what we're calling bulk silicate planets, bulk silicate exoplanets, based on the star's compositions. We do the same thing for our sun to make a hypothetical bulk silicate Earth. And of course, this isn't an exact translation. A lot can happen in a planet's history. And I can illustrate that by plotting what we think is the actual composition of bulk silicate Earth here in blue. So we purposely did not bootstrap this conversion to Earth as we know it. We tried to make as few assumptions as possible so we didn't bias our results. So we selected 2 hypothetical bulk exoplanet compositions. The orange one has a higher magnesium to silicon ratio than Earth. The purple one has a higher a lower magnesium to silicon ratio to Earth. But more importantly, it has a higher calcium to aluminum ratio. So here I'm showing the same type of ternary plot, just zoomed in on that top apex. And we're just showing the same data. It's in calcium silicon aluminum space. And notice that the hypothetical exoplanets in the inset are at the edges of the point cloud, whereas in the larger plot, we're keeping approximately the same iron magnesium ratio as Earth. So we're focusing on what we call Earth adjacent compositions. We're not getting too crazy in terms of all the possible composition. And I do want to stress that we didn't pick a particular star or exoplanet to do a conversion to simulate our experiments. We're not interested in simulating specific planets for our research. What we're doing is using this data visualization as a guide to what's theoretically possible for the compositions of rocky planets in our galaxy. And our ultimate goal is to create something like to expand or create a new geochemical model so we can simulate mantle melting on planets that don't have a strictly Earth-like composition. And we think investigating these end members is the best avenue to that. So how do we do this experiment? So first, like I said, we're putting our starting composition based on that plot into our little capsule, make an assembly that fits around it. It goes into the end-loaded piston cylinder. We bring it up to pressure and temperature for anywhere from a day to 3 days, maybe a week, depending on the temperatures and pressures of the experiment. After the experiment is over, we retrieve the capsule, we cut it in half. So this is cut open and laid open like a book. The silver is showing us the capsule material, and those black dashes are all of the simulated mantle and melt material we made during our experiment. So we'll take this to our electron probe, and we do a whole series of experiments in piston cylinder that are going to produce something that looks like this. We have either a completely holocrystalline mantle composed of the mantle minerals that we're familiar with, or we have something with small amounts of magma, which are small amounts of melt, which represent the magma that could be erupted on that surface. These images are backscattered electron images where the brighter areas are equal to areas of higher atomic number. So the really bright spots here are spinels, which are Fe bearing. So when we look at the exoplanet melts that we produced, I'm going to contextualize them a little bit in terms of some Earth melts that we're more familiar with. This is a total alkalis versus silica diagram, which is a type of plot that petrologists use to classify igneous rocks. So here I'm showing Earth ocean island basalts and mid-ocean ridge basalts in the gray. And then these are the melts that we produced in our experiments. So the high Mg to Si bulk silicate planet, it produced basalts, which is what was expected. But our high calcium to aluminum exoplanet, so we're pushing into the basaltic andesite field and even into the andesites. And you can look at the same data again in calcium and aluminum space. Again, our ocean island basalts and our mid-ocean ridge basalts. And then we overplot our experimental results, and we see that all of our melts have higher calcium contents in general than our Earth melts. And you might think, well, all right, but melts from other planets in our solar system have really different compositions from Earth. How do they plot here? And we see that they're actually more similar to Earth melts than not. A more conservative illustrator might have closed off that gap in the ocean island basalts, in which case all these melts would be contained into the Earth fields. So we see again that our experimental melts are really high in calcium, and that does make sense from the melting reactions and the mineral assemblages that we see in our experiments, but it wasn't what we expected. We actually created the high calcium to aluminum composition because we wanted to create a mantle that was just full of clinopyroxene. There were some studies like by Cayman Enterborn that showed that the solidus of the planet could be greatly controlled by the clinopyroxene content, for example. But actually we ended up crystallizing very little clinopyroxene, a lot of orthopyroxene. So this, again, really underlines the role that bulk silicate planet composition can play in the resulting melt composition, and why doing these kinds of experiments is important. We're already getting results before we've done any further analysis that's really different than what we expected. So the first thing we do after we do these kinds of experiments is we try to find the experimental solidus for this new system. So here I'm showing a phase diagram with pressure reverse and then temperature on the x-axis. Each of these little pie charts represent an individual experiment, and each section of the pie is colored in if that mineral or that melt was present. And the usual mantle minerals here formed again, clinopyroxene, orthopyroxene, olivine, and spinel. And we use the presence of melt, that red pie piece, to draw our solidus. This is just a line that separates regions where everything is solid to a region where melt can be present. I can simplify this further and show you this without the pie pieces, and I'm overplotting also Earth's estimated solidus, dry solidus. So again, we have pressure reverse, so the surface is at the top, temperature, and then we have the results from our experiments. And you can see there's not much different here, so that tells us that changing the magnesium to silicon ratio of our rocky exoplanet probably doesn't have much effect on the solidus, not much of an effect on the melting relationships. Also not much of an effect on the mantle mineral assemblage. It's basically the same as Earth. However, the experiments on our high calcium to aluminum exoplanet show that changing this ratio does affect the location of the solidus and its slope. And this is the second important finding of our study. The location of the solidus is important because it gives us clues to the melting behavior of the exoplanet. So for example, I can plot here an adiabat, which is the pressure temperature path that a packet of mantle material is going to follow during simple decompression melting. So the packet of mantle rises, it hits the solidus for the high magnesium silicon planet, the orange one, and then it starts melting as it hits this line where melt is suddenly allowed. And for this planet, melting is going to begin at about 20 kilobars, which is similar for Earth. However, for the high calcium to aluminum exoplanet, we're a little bit off the scale here, so we had to extrapolate our results a bit, the higher pressures. We found here, it's possible that melting might begin as early as 90 kilobars. This means that melting in this exoplanet could begin at pressures more than 4 times higher than Earth, so there could be a much greater extent of melting on this hypothetical exoplanet. And I want to pause here and take a look at the temperature where this adiabat is pinned to the surface. This is called the mantle potential temperature. And we pin this adiabat to what we think is a contemporary Earth mantle potential temperature of about 1330 degrees Celsius. But we think throughout much of Earth's history, the mantle potential temperature was a lot higher than today, maybe more like 1500 degrees. That's how we get those komatiite melts early in Earth's history. Exoplanets, of course, could have a higher mantle potential temperature too. So if we shift the adiabat to higher mantle potential temperature, and notice we're being conservative here, we're only going to 1450 degrees Celsius. This means for that purple planet, the high calcium to aluminum exoplanet, the adiabat is always above the solidus. There's no intersection of these, which means this planet is likely to have a persistent superficial magma ocean. This is obviously pretty bad news for life as we know it. We don't know of any life that can survive in magma, but it also does go back to the availability of these bioessential elements. If there's no solid land masses to weather into a waterway, then there's not a clear pathway for that phosphorus to get back into life as we know it. Okay, and I have a new finding, some experiments that we're doing now. We actually took our high calcium to aluminum exoplanet composition, which was originally limited in the oxides. We expanded it to give it a full, like a 10 cation composition. And we see that then we're actually moving the solidus even farther away from Earth. So let's say it's probably likely that this planet is going to have a magma ocean, but let's say that the planet cools and solidifies after a very long amount of time. Would the planet be habitable then? So for this, we're going to think about melt migration, which is a process where little pockets of melt, they coalesce and they move upwards through the crystalline magma body where they can perhaps coalesce into an eruptible body. Melt migration is pretty complicated, so we're just going to think about a really simplified version where we're only looking at the density contrast between the melt and the surrounding crystals. So here we're using this density contrast to approximate the velocity of each experimental exoplanet melt relative to Earth more. So we're just taking the solid minerals from our experiment, we're using that for our solid density, and then this melt that we made in your experiments, that's representing the composition of these hypothetical exoplanet mantles or magmas. So for these planets, we find that the density contrast shows that the velocity of these melts relative to more are 30% or 40% slower. So that means that this high calcium to aluminum exoplanet, it's possible that its melts would not rise and coalesce into an eruptible volume. Instead, they might cool, just stall underground and solidify there as an intrusive rock. Of course, there are other ways to produce melt than this archetypal stratovolcano that I'm showing you here, but this unfavorable density contrast could still prevent any magma that formed from some other means from actually reaching the surface. So what does this mean? This means no volcano. This means not much volatiles are released into the atmosphere, so it's going to be difficult to make that secondary atmosphere, which is what we enjoy here on Earth today. It means we're not making new crusts on the surface, and it's also, again, bad news for life because all those elements that are crucial to life, they're trapped underground out of reach. So this kind of result emphasizes the difference between a planet being habitable to life in maybe an instant or over thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, but it's not going to be capable of supporting life over the long term. So to sum up this section, were our Earth-like planets geochemically habitable? For our high magnesium to silicon exoplanet, yes, it was remarkably similar to Earth. There were some small differences, but overall we saw similar melting relationships, solidus, mantle, template, etc. However, for our high calcium to aluminum exoplanet, based on the density contrast, we think that magma here probably can't erupt, which has some pretty bad downstream effects for life. And most damningly, the bioessential elements like ionic cycling is going to be restricted. And even for like a stagnant lid planet, we could have, like volatile triggered melts. There could be like a lithospheric gravitational instability or something like that. But still, this unfavorable density contrast is probably going to keep anything from reaching the surface. And most importantly, these planets are probably just going to have a persistent global magma ocean. So the magma ocean, like maybe we're going to be able to observe evidence of that, but observing restricted bioessential element cycling, probably not going to be able to see that in an atmospheric observation. So it's really crucial to use experiments to help improve our models and to give us better information about this, to make sure that our JWST and future observatories like Habitable Worlds, their targets are stars that are actually able to host planets that are probably habitable to life as we know it. And of course, then putting here in big pink, none of our existing geochemical models could predict any of the results of our experiments that I'm showing here. Okay, so part one, it was like kind of a bummer for the solar system. So part two is a little more optimistic. I'm going to talk about complete mantle melting in vacuous magma oceans. And our question is, can rocky exoplanets produce and retain enough water to be habitable? So many exoplanet science models are simulating this coupled evolution of planets and their overlying atmospheres. We're using these complicated stacked models, and the part that's most relevant to our work, I have to turn that up and on. No, it's the projector.
What was doing this last semester?
Yeah, it's always like turning off in the middle of my lectures.
That's sending out, it's just gonna be application.
Can I ask you a question? This is starting.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm not understanding why you have a persistent magma ocean, given, that it doesn't cross the adiabat. It's gonna cool at the surface eventually, right?
It will cool the surface, but it's so far below the adiabat that we're just have melting all the way down past that's until I say like 90 kilobars. Yeah.
But this
So-
doesn't mean that if you had an Earth-like composition, the Earth may still be a magma
we're
ocean
probably-
today, right?
Sorry, can you repeat?
The Earth wouldn't still be a magma ocean today if it had that high calcium aluminum ratio.
No, but as I was saying, if we did cool and solidify, then the density contrast that we're producing in our experiments tells us that probably volcanism isn't favorable in that situation. So that's still gonna cut off that pathway for life, because any phosphorus that does happen to get weathered out, now that there's a surface, as soon as it's buried under layers of rock, then we're just not gonna get it back again. It's gonna be really hard to get it back again to the surface.
So on the one hand, you're saying magma ocean all the way to the surface, and on the other, you're saying no magma at the surface.
We're saying magma ocean all the time, most likely, but if it did happen to cool enough so there's a solid surface, any subsequent melting is probably not gonna make it to the surface.
I mean, it has to be on that, to solidify at the surface.
Eventually, yeah,
Yeah.
but then we're still not gonna have a surface that's habitable over the long term because our elements are hidden away. Okay, so complicated models, interior history of the planet over millions of years, and then moving to the surface, we're evolving the atmosphere. These are very complicated models. Mostly it's a bunch of separate models that are put together and fed into each other. But the part of these models that's most relevant to our work is this interface between a primary atmosphere and an early planet's magma ocean. So this is the first atmosphere that's accreted with a planet that's mostly composed of molecular hydrogen. So there was a recent study done from UCLA that was a modeling study that showed that it's possible to get a contemporary Earth-like water budget through only normal redox reactions between a magma ocean and the atmosphere. And the implication here is that we don't require a late delivery of volatiles to make up this water budget. Now, they're not saying that it would never occur. We know from isotopic signatures on Earth that oil water was probably delivered from this late veneer, but it's possible for other planets, based on this model, that without that late delivery, there could still be an Earth-like water budget. So this joins some other papers that also say that this late veneer is not required. And this is a really important thing to explore, because if it's not required, it means it eliminates an aspect of luck from this habitability question. So if Earth-like water abundances are more easy to acquire than we thought, if a planet could just manufacture it on its own, that's one less hurdle for life as we know it. So the question is, can we put enough water into a magma ocean through these interactions? And can the magma ocean hold on to that water? So for the geochemists, petrologists in the room, I'll say that for this, we did experiments with upper to iron leucite, so we have a more reduced FO2 environment consistent with this early planet's history. And we also used a modified pyrrolite composition to simulate a young, undifferentiated planet, maybe one that only had a core differentiated. And here we use an iron-free concentration or composition in order to enable our downstream analytical instruments. So first, I want to talk a brief solubility review. So most of us are familiar with the reverse of solubility with this S, which is X solution. So we have something like about propane. When the cork is on, it's under pressure. It's a higher pressure than ambient. When we release the pressure, suddenly the pressure drops, and all the carbon dioxide that was in solution comes out of solution, forms those bubbles that we love. Oh, and generally, this is how volatile solubility works. As pressure increases, the solubility goes up, inverse relationship with temperature. But for hydrogen, a lot of these details are not very well understood, particularly this effective pressure and the effective composition of solubility. We're interested in the solubility of hydrogen in a young magma ocean. So we're going to need hydrogen solubility in a silicate liquid that's pretty primitive. But there's not a lot of data out there at the conditions we're interested in. Now, hydrogen solubility studies have been going on for a really long time. There are dozens of them out there, but they generally share the same problem, which is that they're looking at compositions that aren't primitive enough to be directly applied to magma oceans. And often the temperatures they're investigating are far too low. One of these is actually an experiment on a pure silica composition. And there's a good reason why most of the compositions in these experiments are more evolved. That's because the more primitive you get through composition, the more difficult the solubility experiment just is to do. There are a lot more hurdles to get over for this experiment to be successful. But the current state of the art that's being used in these models is this paper where they looked at an acidic and a basaltic composition. And as you move towards the more primitive mantellite compositions, we saw a decrease in the solubility of molecular hydrogen. They suggested that you could use something called ionic porosity to extrapolate to more mantellite compositions. Ionic porosity is like a measure of the pore space in a pseudostructure where molecular hydrogen can fit in. But this paper is really careful to say that, hey, this is only based on 2 points. It's an idea. Further experimentation is needed. So there is some uncertainty here in how things could go at the mantle end. And again, this is a relationship that a lot of these exoplanet models are based on. So I wanted to resolve this uncertainty and get a direct measurement at a mantle-like composition instead of using an extrapolation. So again, the biggest challenge in these experiments is finding a starting composition that is mantle-like, so the right composition, completely melts in our apparatus, in our case, a piston cylinder. Here I was doing tests in a vertical furnace, and also we needed to quench to a pure glass to reflect the frozen magma ocean. So this is again our TAS diagram, and this is the salt and the andesite from the previous study in the squares, and the triangle is showing our composition, the lower silica content. And we also designed our composition to have a higher NV over T, which is like a shorthand for the polymerization of the structure. So we did very similar experiments as the previous ones, except these are double capsule piston and cylinder experiments. Inside that outer capsule is another smaller inner capsule that was 3 millimeters in diameter. In between the 2 capsules, we have a solid iron lucite buffer that's helping us control the FO2 of the experiment. Afterwards, we extract the capsules, peel off the outer capsule and all the material. Hopefully we get a nice clear glass in our inner capsule. Then we can take it to our other experiment or our analytical methods. Now, this is an example of what we don't want to see. This is a bad experiment. It's really pretty, but it's full of all these quench crystals. So none of these crystals were there when the experiment was actually running. These all formed when we dropped the pressure and temperature, and all these crystals suddenly came out of solution. So we could try to take a measurement at one of the pools that are wet, but it's already had some elements removed to make the crystal, so it's not a true reflection of what was happening in a magma ocean at that time. What we want is something that basically looks like nothing. I'm sorry for this, this is a really unexciting looking sample, but I was thrilled when I saw this. It took a long time to get here. So this is a beautiful, clear, clean, crystal-free glass that's the best representation you can get of a primitive magma ocean that's still molten. So we're just freezing the system and looking at a snapshot of what's happening at this atmosphere magma ocean interface. Again, our hydrogen source in this experiment was pure H2. It was not water, it was not OH. So we're directly simulating this kind of situation. Unfortunately, there was no H2. So we had done this experiment because we expected, based on that previous study, to see a small amount, but a certain predicted amount of molecular hydrogen based on their that ionic porosity relationship. Unfortunately, you can see here in the FTIR, we have a dry control experiment where no hydrogen is added on the top, and a couple of thin cylinder experiments. We see very clear peaks for water and OH, nothing for H2. Same thing for the ramen. And then we also looked at NMR, which is really sensitive to H. We use hydrogen, magic angle splitting, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, first to confirm the presence of hydrogen to see if our experiments were even working before we continued, and then later to look more closely at the bonding environment. So even though we're using, in this case, a depth routine to suppress background hydrogen signals that are coming from outside of the sample coil, the sample coil and the rotor itself are still made of a polymer that includes hydrogen. So no matter what you do, we're not going to get a perfectly flat background spectra here. So this is the empty rotor, no sample added. This is what we're working with. If we add a control experiment where no hydrogen is added, you can see it follows that background from the rotor, and we have a small bump there around 0. So we can look at data from an actual experiment, and we see this clear, nice peak at about 2 ppm, representing the hydrogen that was put into our sample. Now this is full hydrogen in this case, because there was no issue. But we can look at previous NMR studies. This is one from Bjorn at Carnegie in 2011, and they were looking at different types of glasses that were synthesized at different oxygen bagasse environments. And they saw this very nice, clear, sharp peak for molecular hydrogen at 5 ppm. We don't see that peak in our sample at all. And I want to note that if you turn it up and on again.
You know, just curious, you said that she's gonna bring somebody after the talk, so hopefully for your class tomorrow, that we could.
What are you doing? You're having something like you?
Yeah. Yeah. Because they did it last semester too.
It does it during my lectures too, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we don't see this 5 ppm H2 signature in our samples, in any of our samples. If we look closer at this previous study's work, if we look at the full integral, the total integral over this full spectrum, this 5 ppm peak represents about 1% of the total hydrogen speciated as H2. So we think that NMR is very sensitive to hydrogen speciation. This amount of H2, it might not be that detectable in vibrational spectroscopy, depending on your sample prep, that kind of thing. So we think that this is pretty definitive evidence that no, there was no molecular hydrogen, none of the reduced species of hydrogen put into our very primitive mantle-like samples, even though we were running at reduced conditions. So let's put this together with the previous studies. So here I'm showing silica, in this case reversed, so we're moving to more primitive as we go to the right. And this is showing just the molecular hydrogen contents of these glasses. We have the previous study of andesite, the basalt, and our study of square. Technically, it follows the trend, but we were honestly expecting to find at least, like maybe 0.1% or something. We were expecting to see a little bit. But when we overlay the amount of total hydrogen we see in these experiments, the situation changes. So this is the total hydrogen calculated as H2O in the samples. And we see that, again, for their samples, there's a clear trend from the andesites to the salts. But for us, our more mantle-like composition was able to include over 7% hydrogen as H2O. This was much more than we were expecting. Again, it's not predicted by models. But let's look at ionic porosity. Remember, that was the parameter that they suggested could be used to extrapolate this data to more mantle-like conditions. And for their data, they see a very clean trend between both the abundance of total hydrogen and just the molecular hydrogen as we go to higher on ionic porosities, which means more unoccupied volume. Makes sense because that's conceivably more extra space to stuff in these molecules. However, when we overplot our data, we see that again, the H2 is breaking that trend, and we have a lot more total hydrogen than we had expected. So what we think here is happening is that ionic porosity tracks the total hydrogen content, not the amount of H2. And I have more I could say about that after the talk is over. And I'm not saying here that all primitive mantle-like compositions are going to have this much water and no H2. But what I am saying is that this does not appear that ionic porosity is a good way to extrapolate to higher, to lower silica compositions. And again, I want to emphasize that all of our existing geochemical models can't predict these experimental results. We use several hygrometers that are made for more primitive systems, and none of them matched our experimental images. So if we go back to these studies that are suggesting that planets could make their own hydrogen through normal reactions with their atmosphere, our study shows that yes, we do think that enough water can be absorbed in this young planet's magma ocean. In fact, there's more water than we expected. And all of the H&R experiments bonded in the melt as H2O or OH. None went into the melt through the structure as H2. And a similar study done on our same grant team at Carnegie showed that in 1 atmosphere experiments, there was also no H2 at reducing conditions. Again, and for their experiments, everything speciated as OH. Even though our experiments had much more measured total hydrogen than we had expected based on this previous trend from this other study, we put this back into that other model, and we see that we can still match Earth's water abundance, present day water abundance, with this higher solubility. And so we haven't increased the hydrogen solubility past the point where we can still match contemporary Earth. If that makes sense. So that story still holds together. So our future work has to do with creating new experimental methods to conduct these experiments at even higher pressures. Right now, we're pretty limited, again, by our experimental apparatus, by our methods. We'd like to do these experiments in a multi-anvil so we can look at pressures from like 4 to 10 GPa and get to more of a sub-Neptune type of composition, sub-Neptune size. But we need to do a little development before those experiments are going to work. So lastly, let's take a quick look at phosphorus solubility. So this is an ongoing project that we've just gotten started with my grant team back at ASU. And our question now is, how does a rocky planet's composition affect the amount of phosphorus that is able to be brought back to the surface for a given planet? And this ICAR grant is interested in which elements are most crucial to include in our observations of exoplanet atmospheres so we can determine whether a planet is habitable based on those. So recall again that we're looking at phosphorus. It's this bioessential element that's kind of the rate limiting step for all the different elements that are involved with our DNA and with life. And in our experiments, we want to know what range of phosphorus abundances still allows sufficient phosphorus cycling so we can sustain life over the long term. And we're already seeing some really interesting trends of how the bulk composition of the mantle affects the amount of phosphorus in an extracted melt and how this can affect mantle dynamics. I've already shown you this result from one of our first experiments that shows that our high calcium to aluminum solvents has actually been further away from Earth than we thought. So we want to know also wrapped into this is what are the downstream effects of this high calcium to aluminum exoplanet? If we have this higher CA to Al ratio than Earth, what other effects do we see? So you remember that we had very high calcium melts for this particular planet. And in comparing these results to a recent study from Valley Pyre, we see that there's a strong correlation between high calcium aluminum melts produced by a planet and this change in mantle mineralogy. So we have the calcium to aluminum ratio in the melt on the x-axis, and then the olivine to OPS % ratio in the mantle on the y-axis. So our more Earth-like planet, it plots with that arrow on the far left. It's actually off the scale of this chart that reflects a strongly olivine-dominated mantle, like Earth's, whereas our high calcium to aluminum exoplanet, which is the light blue circles, that's showing us a major change in composition from olivine-dominated to instead orthopyroxene-dominated mantles. And this was a surprising result of our experiments, and it's really interesting to see it compiled with Dr. Pyre's research because we get this nice smooth trend in the mineralogy of the mantle versus the liquids that are produced. And a side note on this mineralogy change, also from our research project, a grad student at Penn State who's working on a grant has been doing some thermal modeling. This is Chandan Sahu. He's looking at how changing the mantle mineralogy can affect a mantle's thermal history and other characteristics. So here he's showing how an olivine-dominated mantle versus a pyroxene-dominated mantle has very different melt production rates over the history of the planet. Initially, for the climate pyroxene-dominated planet, we have a very high melt production rate, then it drops off much more steeply than our olivine-dominated planet. And then for temperature evolution of the planet, we see that for basically all times in the planet's history, our olivine-dominated mantle, this planet is going to have a higher temperature. Now, this is going to affect the planet's adiabat and also its melt production and its surface conditions. The climate pyroxene planet is always going to be a bit colder. The CPX's lower viscosity is the biggest lever on these results, and this shows that understanding the mantle composition of the exoplanet has an importance beyond just petrology or geochemical studies. The mantle composition can have far-reaching implications for the geophysical characteristics of the planet too. Okay, but back to phosphorus. So our high calcium to aluminum bulk silicate planets produce melts with higher calcium and also they leave behind a mantle with a lot of orthopyroxene. These high calcium melts, it turns out, also are very strong carriers for phosphorus. So in this plot, I'm showing again the calcium to aluminum ratio in the liquid, and then the phosphorus content that's able to be carried at phosphate saturation. And you see this strong positive trend between the calcium content and the amount of phosphorus that's able to be carried in these liquids to the surface. So it's possible that these high calcium melts can carry, because they carry more phosphorus, could have just a more vigorous phosphorus cycle that's very favorable to life as we know it. But we don't really understand what happens when there's that much phosphorus on the planet's surface over the long term. So that requires some more study. We have a new internally heated pressure vessel at ASU. So the next step will be to take our melts and put them into that, see what types of minerals that we're able to crystallize when we simulate something cooling on the surface or the near surface of a planet. So to sum up all of the results here, there's no slam dunks here. We didn't find anything that's like, yes, absolutely habitable, or no, it's never going to work. We have ideas of where they fit along the spectrum, but it's clear that more experiments are needed, both to increase the number of compositional differences we're looking at from Earth, and just to explore more about what's happening with the phosphorus side of the story and what happens when we change that mantle mineralogy. So I hope I've convinced you today that experiments are a necessary step to extend our petrological knowledge and our understanding of habitability beyond Earth. Today, I've discussed some possible impacts on habitability that have been inferred from our experiments. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that our existing models just can't predict any of our experimental results. We need more experiments in order to extend our models beyond the chemistry of the solar system. That's going to allow us to investigate what exoplanets are most likely to be geochemically habitable, so we can prioritize our observation targets and better interpret our observations of these exoplanets. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Before we get into questions, I want to let everybody know we do not have a speaker next week. I know, hold your tears, but we will the following February 25th. It will be Cole Nypaver with the Smithsonian Institute. So definitely come back in 2 weeks. Now, does anybody have any questions for Kara?
Yes, Carl.
So this is a really interesting result with the calcium aluminum ratio having so much influence over the solidus temperatures, and and also the stability of orthopyroxene. This is all very, very surprising. I think, as you just pointed out, but I mean, typically the thing that people point to for suppressing the solidus temperature is iron. So either iron-rich melts or can have lower solidus temperatures, and then stabilizing orthopyroxene over olivine. It's a silica content, not the aluminum calcium aluminum ratio. It's actually the silicon to magnesium ratio.
Well, we did have a slightly lower magnesium to silicon ratio than Earth, so that we did have exactly the same as Earth in all of our different cations. But the calcium to aluminum difference was the biggest difference from Earth that we had.
Are you going to explore iron-rich compositions as well? Because if you look at the solar system, we have the moon and Mars. Obviously, they're not Earth size, but they both have very supposedly iron-rich mantles.
Yeah.
Feel-rich.
Yeah, that's not in our immediate plans, but certainly my NSF grant is actually to extend these experiments looking at those ternary compositions, and that's one of the directions that we'll go once the lab is up and running and I have a student to do experiments. Yes. Yeah.
Actually, I have a question.
Yes.
On extending your compositions, would you look at more stars that are unlike our solar composition, like M stars, Wheeler stars?
For us, no,
Okay.
we don't think so. We think that the best thing to do is to look at things that are as close to Earth and our solar system as possible and just change those chemical building blocks a little bit. The problem, the thing that keeps me up at night is what if we change the composition so much that we're not even able to interpret what we get from our experiment, I don't think we're gonna make any new minerals or anything like that. So we get something that's so weird, like what are we even gonna have to say about it? So it's better to make incremental progress, maybe, talk to me again in like 20 years. And we'll see where we are with our student email. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. I love it.
Sure.
Thank you so much for the talk. You said that, well, first of all, how did you buffer the hydrogen for gasoline in your experiments?
So we use an iron lucite buffer, and then water is only placed in the outer capsule. So we use We use FH2 to control FO2. So the capsule material is made so only molecular hydrogen is able to pass through it. So no water is in like the starting mix or anything. There's no, I don't know, previous effects of water on the melt before the hydrogen can get to it.
And then I think you also said you measured hydrogen H2 abundance with the SIMS.
We did our total hydrogen
Yeah.
measurement with the SIMS,
And then you, oh, well.
the net, yeah.
The
And
rest you
then,
did with other.
yeah, the H2, we looked at, I used every single FTI and Raman at Carnegie to try to find this H2 because I was so convinced it was going to be there. It was not there, so. Yeah.
And then I guess my last question is something we've been working on and thinking about a lot, and thinking through already. You're doing these experiments at high pressure, right?
Mhm.
And you're getting the solubilities at high pressure. I would argue that the amount of hydrogen dissolved in a planet is determined by the surface. The surface,
So
and
this-
only the surface.
This is an important thing that I think I didn't mention. So when we were looking at, let me back up and just here. So these experiments were designed for super Earth. So the pressure of a super Earth, we think would be maybe 10 kilobars. So we're are looking at the surface atmosphere interface,
So
but for larger planets in this case.
this would be an H2 pressure of 10 kilobars.
Correct.
So I think.
So it's a much bigger planet. And then the reason why we want to go to even higher pressures is not just because we need that higher pressure end to really make a good model for the hydrogen solubility, but we're interested in what happens at the surface atmosphere interface for some Neptunes, which are even more massive. We think those surface pressures are more like 10 GPa.
And for Earth size, it would be more like 100 bars.
Yeah, or less. And that's why, what we do, I showed these experiments from my colleague Maggie Thompson, who's working on the same grant, and she's looking at the lower pressure end of the story. You might have also seen some papers that came out at the end of last year from my colleague Francesca Miazzi, who's working on the higher end part of this grant. So she did diamond anvil expel experiments looking at the solubility of hydrogen in like more like deep mantle near core compositions.
In that case, though, again, I think that it's still pinned by the surface.
For sure, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that deep mantle may tell you what's going in the core. Okay?
Yeah, and another interesting thing to think about, which I haven't had a chance to consider much, is that for the sub-Neptunes, they're so massive that you actually have this supercritical surface, so it's not really a solid at those pressures. So those interactions are like a whole other story to dig into later.
We have a question in the chat
Yes.
from Austin Partridge at UT San Antonio. In your results, most of the redox conditions you show look clustered around lunar-style iron woostite buffers. Do you plan to expand your oxygen viscosity space to include both more reduced conditions and more oxidized conditions in FMQ and NO, and even some FMQ 2+ and +5 that Earth and some unusual CK meteorites approach? What implications might your mantle, adiabat, melt, and solidus models have at higher O2?
So on the higher, more oxidized end, no, we're not going to look into that much because that's really been done extensively for Earth. We have a lot of studies on hydrogen solubility from the volcanology community that they use to construct their volatile solubility models. We are very interested in looking at conditions that are more reduced than iron woostite. Ideally, I would be looking at something more like iron woostite -2 or less. Because based on like the paper from Ali Doyle that came out, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago now, she was looking at material that you can detect on the surface of white dwarfs. So these planetesimals that are broken up and accrete under the surface. And from that, she inferred that the kind of intrinsic FO2 of planetary materials seems to be about iron woostite -2. So ideally, we would be getting more reduced. The problem is that we're already up at the edge of what we're able to do in a piston cylinder. We had to do like a specialized quenching procedure in order to not create quench crystals in our glasses. And if we go up to higher pressures, then we're running into the problem of hydrogen embrittlement. So the interaction of hydrogen with our capsule material and our assembly materials, and also the interaction of our buffer with the capsule is lowering the melting point enough so that we can't successfully do an experiment. So that's why I said that our next step here is to develop a new experimental method. So we are able to look at more reduced conditions and at higher pressures. Yes.
So I was confused by the phosphorus, capacity as the calcium over aluminum rises. I mean, Earth on that diagram would be in the low phosphorus range, right? And it's a habitable planet, so are you arguing that this extra phosphorus somehow, because there's more of it, it's more likely to be,
Be
erupted
more
at the surface? I mean,
No, so I put this question mark here, good news for habitability question mark, because we don't actually know what it means to have that much phosphorus in a muds or in a crust. So we need more study to look into what happens at those high abundances.
Mhm.
Yeah, unfortunately, none of these are shoved all the way over to the right, like I had hopes, but that's science.
And the y-axis is what goes into the melt, is that right?
Yes, this is the composition of the melt.
Okay.
The melt, yeah.
Of course, that depends on how much phosphorus there is in the
Sure.
total experiment.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've done some melting experiments in presence of hydrogen, and when you make iron metal, as you reduce of a salt or something, the iron is incredibly effective at scavenging all of the phosphorus.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it just disappears from the magma, which has implications for how much phosphorus there is in the core of Earth.
For sure, yeah. This actually reminds me of something else that I don't think I mentioned, or I mentioned, but I don't think I emphasized. So this result we found where we have all of this hydrogen in the more oxidized species. We also don't have any iron in any of these compositions. So our compositions and also this previous study, they're all nominally iron-free. So it's also pretty interesting, like what's doing the oxidizing. We're thinking a lot of the hydrogen is bonded to maybe like magnesium, but we're not entirely sure. It definitely needs more study.
Okay, another question in the chat. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I was wondering if you were able to determine the reaction forming H2O in the iron-free experiments, which were conducted for the hydrogen solubility.
No, that's what I was just saying. So we have evidence from the NMR of the bonding environment, but we didn't have anything definitive that we felt good enough about actually including in our manuscript. So that's like the next series of experiments, look into that a little further.
I think we've got a few more moments if anybody else wants to ask any questions. Okay, anything else from the chat or anybody online?
Since we have some more. But because these are high pressure experiments, you don't see platinum effects.
Mhm.
Yet when you look at, look at our solar system, the budget base is dominant mineral. Several million, also Mars and the Earth. So what is that? What are we missing here? I mean, I'm not saying that these experiments are bad or wrong, but I mean, that's a key mineral that must have
Yeah,
some exoplanet story to it.
and that was another weird thing about these experiments, right? We did expect to see plagioclase, but we only saw spinel. So again, just goes to the unpredictability when we change the composition a little bit.
Because they're done in higher pressure.
These were, so even, let me just go back to our phase diagram. Here. Yeah, so for this is, okay, so this is the high energy SI exoplanet. This isn't even the weirder calcium exoplanet. So from here, we also only had spinel. We did not have plagioclase. Granted, we didn't do experiments that were below 1 GPa, but it was still like very clearly spinel and well-formed spinel.
With aluminum, I
So
mean,
it's weird, yeah.
maybe some experiments with that device they have now in ASU where you can do, it's that pressure realm between gas mixing one atmosphere and
The IHPD.
and the distant cylinder, where
Yeah.
probably it's hard. I think if you start going up on pressure, it just gets harder and harder to stabilize platinum.
Yeah.
Anyway. just a comment.
Yeah, there's a lot of it was probably not the best project for me to do for my first experimental project. I probably should have done something that was more like normal Earth, because I I was like, what am I seeing here? It seemed very weird, but I feel like I'm not an expert enough to interpret this, and my advisor's like, no, this is extremely bizarre, so.
I'm talking with Carl too. Is there any polyvalent elements in these experiments or no?
No, these are like simple oxide compositions. So I don't think I have things to here. I think I think this composition did include a small amount of nickel. But for the high calcium to aluminum exoplanet, we just had like the 5 major oxides. But this one also includes like the rest of the alkalis and like phosphorus. So it's really huge. Yeah.
And that will bring us to time. Thank you for wrapping us up, guys. Thank you again.